The red shoes were the first thing anyone noticed, small and bright against the wood chips beneath the swing set, abandoned like their owner had simply vanished mid-flight. It was 4:04 p.m. on June 17, 1964, a Wednesday afternoon so ordinary that nobody would have believed it could fracture into nightmare within the space of 5 minutes. But that's exactly what happened in the playground at Crafts Avenue Park in Springfield, Massachusetts. Mary Brooks had looked away for maybe 300 seconds, maybe less. Her attention pulled to her infant son, who'd started fussing in his pram, and when she turned back to check on her daughter, to call out that it was almost time to head home for supper, Ella was gone. The swing she'd been pumping her little legs on still moved slightly, a ghost momentum, and those red shoes sat there like a taunt, like evidence of something impossible. Because 4-year-old Ella Brooks never went anywhere without her red shoes, she pitched an absolute fit that morning when Mary had suggested the brown ones instead. And now here they were without her feet in them, without her anywhere. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. Mary's scream cut through the peaceful afternoon sounds of children playing and mothers chatting, a raw animal sound that made everyone in that playground freeze and turn. She was standing by the empty swing set, holding her baby against her chest with one hand and pointing with the other at nothing, at absence, at the space where her daughter should have been. The other mothers rushed over asking what was wrong, what happened, where's Ella, and Mary couldn't make her mouth work properly to explain, could only keep pointing at those red shoes while her brain tried to catch up with a reality that made no sense. Ella had been right there on that swing. Mary had heard her laughing maybe a minute ago, that bright 4-year-old giggle that sounded like bells. She'd been wearing her favorite yellow dress with the white flowers, her dark hair and pigtails tied with ribbons Mary had fixed that morning while Ella wiggled and complained about sitting still. She'd been real and solid and safe, and now she was nowhere. The other women spread out immediately, calling Ella's name, checking behind the small brick bathroom building, looking in the cupboard picnic area, walking the perimeter of the playground's chain-link fence. One of them ran to the payphone at the corner store 2 blocks away to call the police. Another started stopping people on the street, asking if they'd seen a little girl in a yellow dress, dark hair, 4 years old, this tall. The men who'd been playing basketball on the nearby court abandoned their game and joined the search, checking the wooded area that bordered the park's east side, calling out for Ella in voices that tried to sound cheerful and encouraging but had edges of panic creeping in. Within 20 minutes, it seemed like half the neighborhood was there. Irish Catholic families from the tight-knit community surrounding Crafts Avenue, people who knew the Brooks family from St. Michael's Church, who'd seen Ella toddling around in her red shoes at coffee hour after Sunday Mass. Springfield Police Department received the call at 5:03 p.m., and patrol units were dispatched immediately because missing child calls got priority always, even though 9 times out of 10 the kid turned up within an hour having wandered off to follow a dog or gotten confused about which playground their mother was at. Officer Daniel Murphy arrived first, a beat cop who'd grown up 3 streets over from where the Brooks family lived on Berkshire Avenue, and he could see immediately that this wasn't a case of a kid playing hide-and-seek or losing track of time. Mary Brooks was bordering on hysterical, coherent enough to give details but barely, and the crowd of neighbors searching the area had the kind of desperate energy that told Murphy they'd already checked the obvious places multiple times. He radioed for backup and for a supervisor, then started taking information while trying to keep Mary calm enough to answer questions. Ella Marie Brooks, 4 years and 2 months old, approximately 3 feet tall, maybe 35 pounds, dark brown hair and pigtails with blue ribbons, brown eyes, wearing a yellow dress with white flowers and white sandals. No, wait, she wasn't wearing shoes. Her shoes were right there by the swing. Gee, Detective Frank Sullivan got the call just as he was about to leave the station for the day, heading home to his own 3 kids and the pot roast his wife had cooking. He was 42 years old and had been with the Springfield PD for 19 years, working his way up from patrol to detective, and he'd handled his share of missing person cases, mostly runaways and custody disputes and elderly folks with dementia who wandered off from nursing homes. Child abductions were mercifully rare, at least the stranger abduction kind that everyone secretly feared but nobody wanted to say out loud. Most missing kids were taken by a non-custodial parent or had legitimately just wandered off and gotten lost. But something about the details of this case made Sullivan's stomach clench as he drove toward Crafts Avenue Park with his partner, Detective James Kowalski. A 4-year-old doesn't leave her shoes behind voluntarily. A 4-year-old doesn't vanish from a playground full of people in broad daylight unless something very wrong has happened. By the time Sullivan arrived at 5034 p.m., the scene was controlled chaos. At least 50 people were searching the immediate area, and more were arriving every few minutes as word spread through the neighborhood. Murphy had done a good job securing the playground itself, keeping people from trampling potential evidence, though Sullivan knew that horse had probably already bolted, given how many people had walked through in the first 20 minutes. He found Mary Brooks sitting on a bench near the swing set, still holding her baby, her face blank with shock, while a neighbor woman rubbed her shoulder and tried to get her to drink some water. Sullivan introduced himself gently, crouching down to her eye level, and asked her to walk him through everything that had happened, every detail no matter how small. Mary's story was devastatingly simple. They'd arrived at the playground around 4005 p.m., same as they did every Wednesday afternoon when the weather was nice. It was part of their routine, had been all spring and into the early summer. Ella loved the swings, would stay on them for 20 minutes straight if you let her, pumping her legs and singing to herself. Mary's 3 boys were older, in school until 3, and Wednesdays were her afternoon with just Ella and baby Michael, a few hours of relative peace before the evening chaos of dinner and homework and getting everyone to bed. They'd been at the playground for maybe half an hour. There were other children there, other mothers Mary knew by sight but not by name. Everything was normal, completely normal. Ella was on the swing. Mary was sitting on the bench about 15 feet away with the pram beside her. Michael started fussing, needed his pacifier or maybe a diaper change, and Mary looked down to tend to him. She'd looked away before, dozens of times that afternoon, and Ella had always been fine, always been right there on that swing. But this time when she looked up, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe less, Ella was gone and her shoes were sitting on the ground, and Mary knew, she just knew something terrible had happened. Sullivan asked the hard questions as gently as he could. Had Mary seen anyone suspicious? Anyone paying particular attention to Ella? Any unfamiliar cars? Any adults at the playground without children? Mary shook her head to all of it, said everything had seemed normal, the usual mix of mothers and kids, a few teenagers shooting basketball, some older boys riding bikes past on the street. Nobody stood out, nobody seemed wrong. Sullivan made notes and tried not to show how much that worried him, because if someone had taken Ella, and he was increasingly certain someone had, then they'd done it smoothly enough not to attract attention in a public place in the middle of the afternoon, which suggested planning, which suggests this wasn't an impulsive act. Kowalski was coordinating the search, which had expanded beyond the immediate playground area into the surrounding neighborhoods. Volunteers were checking yards and alleys, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything. The Springfield Fire Department had been called in to help, firefighters trained in search and rescue spreading out in a grid pattern. The wooded area east of the park was being searched thoroughly, officers and volunteers moving slowly through the underbrush, looking for any sign of a small girl in a yellow dress. Sullivan hoped desperately they'd find her there, confused and scared but alive, maybe having chased after a squirrel or gotten turned around in the trees. But as the minutes ticked past and the searchers emerged empty-handed, that hope was fading fast. By 7 p.m., with daylight starting to wane, Sullivan had set up a command post in the parking lot adjacent to the playground. More officers had arrived from surrounding jurisdictions. State police were sending units, and the FBI had been notified per protocol for child abductions, though they wouldn't take over unless the case crossed state lines. Someone had brought floodlights so the search could continue after dark. Someone else had organized the volunteers into more systematic search teams with maps and assigned areas. And Sullivan was conducting interviews, talking to everyone who'd been at or near the playground that afternoon, trying to piece together a timeline, trying to find someone who'd seen something useful. The witnesses were frustratingly vague. A woman remembered seeing a little girl in a yellow dress on the swings, but couldn't say exactly when she'd last noticed her. A teenager said he'd seen a station wagon parked on the street near the playground entrance around 4:30, dark blue or maybe green, but he hadn't paid attention to the license plate or seen anyone get in or out. Another mother thought she'd seen a man standing near the fence watching the children, but when pressed for details, she admitted he might have just been waiting for someone and she couldn't describe him beyond average height, maybe wearing dark pants. These were the kinds of details that drove investigators crazy, specific enough to seem meaningful but too vague to be actionable, the human brain's tendency to fill in gaps with possibilities after the fact. The one witness who gave Sullivan pause was old Mrs. Old, Kowalski, no relation to his partner, who lived in a house that backed onto the park and spent most afternoons sitting on her screened porch watching the neighborhood go by. She told Sullivan she'd seen a man near the playground around 4:30, maybe 4:40. She couldn't be sure of the exact time. He'd been standing by the gate that led to the street, just standing there, and something about him had struck her as odd, though she couldn't articulate what. When Sullivan asked her to describe him, she said he was maybe in his 30s or 40s, average build, wearing work clothes like coveralls or a uniform of some kind, dark-colored. She hadn't seen his face clearly because of the distance and because he'd been partially turned away. She'd watched him for maybe a minute, then gotten distracted by her cat, and when she looked back, he was gone. She didn't know if he'd entered the playground or walked away down the street. She couldn't say if he'd had a child with him, but she remembered thinking it was odd, a man by himself at a playground on a Wednesday afternoon, just standing there watching. Sullivan made a note to follow up on the man in work clothes, though he knew it was a thin lead, could be nothing. Could be a utility worker on break, or a father waiting to pick up his kid, or just someone passing through. But it was something, and right now something was all they had. He radioed for officers to canvass the area for any businesses or residents with employees or visitors who might match that description. He called the Municipal Works Department to find out if they'd had any workers in that area that afternoon. He made a list of every utility company, delivery service, and contractor that might have someone in coveralls or uniform working in the neighborhood. As darkness fell completely and the temperature dropped, Sullivan made the difficult decision to scale back the search until morning. They'd covered a 2-mile radius around the playground, checked every accessible building and yard, dragged the pond in the park 3 blocks away, searched the wooded areas with dogs. If Ella was out there lost or hiding, they would have found her by now. The probability that she'd been taken was approaching certainty, and that meant the investigation had to shift from search and rescue to criminal investigation. Sullivan hated making that mental transition, hated what it implied about Ella's chances, but he'd been a cop long enough to know when hope needed to give way to hard reality. He drove Mary Brooks home around 10 p.m., after she'd finally agreed to leave the playground where she'd been sitting for hours, refusing to abandon the spot where she'd last seen her daughter. Patrick Brooks was there with their 3 boys, Ella's brothers, who were 11, 9, and 7, old enough to understand something terrible had happened but too young to fully grasp what it meant. The house on Berkshire Avenue was small and neat, the kind of working-class home where every surface was clean and every penny was stretched, where faith and family were the foundations of existence. Patrick worked at the Springfield Armory as a machinist. Mary had worked as a secretary before the kids came and still did some typing from home when she could. They were good people, church people, the kind of family that formed the backbone of neighborhoods like this. And now their world was shattered, their daughter gone, and Sullivan had to stand in their living room and tell them that he was going to do everything in his power to find Ella, but that they needed to prepare themselves for a long investigation with no guarantees. The boys were sent to bed, though Sullivan doubted any of them would sleep. Mary sat at the kitchen table, still in the clothes she'd worn to the playground, staring at nothing. Patrick paced, his hands clenching and unclenching, asking questions Sullivan couldn't answer. Who would take Ella? Why? What kind of monster steals a child from a playground? Sullivan gave them his direct number, told them to call any time, day or night, if they thought of anything or if anyone contacted them. He explained that the phones would be monitored in case of a ransom demand, though he privately doubted this was about money. Child abductions for ransom were exceedingly rare. More likely this was something darker, something he didn't want to say out loud to these desperate parents. Sullivan drove back to the station around midnight and found the detective bureau still fully staffed. Everyone working the case, phones ringing with tips from people who'd seen the evening news broadcasts. Most of the tips would lead nowhere, Sullivan knew from experience, but every single one had to be followed up because you never knew which call might be the one that broke the case. He organized his detectives into teams, assigned follow-up tasks, created a timeline on the blackboard, pinned Ella's photograph to the bulletin board where it would stare at them as they worked. She was smiling in the picture, taken at Easter, wearing a frilly dress and holding a basket, her dark eyes bright with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd never known fear or cruelty. Sullivan looked at that photo and made a silent promise that he would find out what happened to her, that he would bring whoever took her to justice, that Ella Marie Brooks would not become just another statistic, another cold case file gathering dust. The next 72 hours were a blur of interviews and tips and false leads and crushing disappointments. The story made front-page news. 4-year-old girl vanishes from Springfield playground, and suddenly everyone in Western Massachusetts was looking for Ella Brooks. Her photo was everywhere, in store windows and on telephone poles and on the evening news. The family's phone rang constantly with reported sightings that sent officers racing to shopping centers and parks and bus stations, only to find different children who just happened to have dark hair and be wearing yellow. A psychic called, claiming to have visions of Ella near water, which led to another exhaustive search of every pond and stream in a 10-mile radius. A woman in Connecticut called saying she'd seen a man forcing a crying child into a car at a rest stop. But when officers investigated, it turned out to be a legitimate father dealing with a tantrum-throwing toddler who was very much his own daughter. The man in the work uniform became a focus of the investigation. Sullivan's team discovered that a groundskeeper named Walter Getz worked for the Parks Department and had been scheduled to do maintenance at Crafts Avenue Park that afternoon, though he claimed he'd finished his work and left by 4 p.m. before Ella disappeared. Getz was in his late 30s, lived alone, had no criminal record, but struck Sullivan as odd in a way that was hard to quantify, something about his affect that felt off. They brought him in for questioning, searched his apartment and his work truck with his consent, found nothing. His alibi for the critical window of time was weak, just his word that he'd gone home and stayed there, but there was nothing to contradict it either. They kept him on the suspect list, but couldn't justify an arrest. Another person of interest was Raymond Marsh, a convicted child molester who'd been released from prison 8 months earlier and was living with his sister in West Springfield just across the river. Marsh had a history of approaching children at playgrounds, though his previous convictions had involved teenage boys rather than young girls. Sullivan and Kowalski drove to the sister's house and found Marsh there, cooperative and seemingly unsurprised by the visit. He claimed he'd been home all day on June 17th, and his sister confirmed it, said she'd been there with him the whole time because his parole required supervision. She seemed credible, but Sullivan didn't like the way Marsh smiled when they showed him Ella's photo, something knowing and smug that made Sullivan's skin crawl. They had nothing to hold him on, though, and his sister's alibi held up under scrutiny. The mysterious station wagon led nowhere. Dozens of people called in saying they owned station wagons that were dark blue or dark green, or knew someone who did, and each one had to be checked out. None of the owners had any connection to the Brooks family or any history that raised red flags. The wagon became another dead end, possibly not even connected to Ella's disappearance, just a random vehicle someone happened to notice and then assigned significance to after the fact. By the end of July, 6 weeks after Ella vanished, the investigation had consumed thousands of man-hours and generated hundreds of leads and solved exactly nothing. Sullivan and his team had interviewed over 300 people, searched dozens of properties, followed up on every credible tip, and most of the incredible ones. They had persons of interest but no evidence, theories but no proof, a massive file of reports and witness statements and dead ends. Ella Brooks had vanished as thoroughly as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only those red shoes and a hole in her family that would never be filled. The media attention began to fade as other stories took precedence. The volunteers stopped showing up to search. The tips slowed to a trickle, and Sullivan sat at his desk, staring at Ella's photograph, feeling the weight of failure settle into his bones, knowing that this case was slipping away from him despite everything he'd done to hold on to it. Mary Brooks called him every single day for the first 3 months, always the same questions. Have you found anything? Are you still looking? Is there any news? Sullivan always took her calls, always gave her what little he could, updates that weren't really updates, reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. He could hear in her voice how grief was consuming her, how she was becoming hollowed out by not knowing, by the torture of uncertainty that was in some ways worse than the finality of death. At least with death you could bury your child and mourn and eventually, maybe, begin to heal. But Ella was just gone, suspended in some awful limbo between alive and dead, present and absent, and Mary was suspended there with her, unable to move forward or back. Sullivan kept working the case even as it officially went cold, even as new cases demanded his attention and the Ella Brooks file got moved to a different cabinet. He couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that someone had taken a 4-year-old from a playground in the middle of the afternoon and gotten away with it completely. He drove past Crafts Avenue Park sometimes on his way home, looking at the swing set where those red shoes had been found, wondering what he'd missed, what small detail might have made the difference. He worked the case for another 25 years until his retirement in 1989, never solving it but never quite giving up either. And when he passed the file to his successor, he made the younger detective promise to keep trying, to not let Ella Brooks be forgotten. The detective promised, meant it. But the years kept passing and the trail stayed cold. And eventually, even the most dedicated investigators had to accept that some mysteries might never be solved, that some families might never get their answers, that some little girls in red shoes might vanish into the dark and never find their way home. Springfield looked different in 2024 than it had in 1964. The old Irish Catholic neighborhoods transformed by waves of immigration and white flight and urban renewal projects that had demolished some blocks and revitalized others. But Crafts Avenue Park remained. The swing sets replaced dozens of mess over 60 years, but still occupying roughly the same footprint, still drawing children and mothers on sunny afternoons. The houses on Berkshire Avenue were mostly rentals now, divided into apartments. The tight-knit community that had mobilized to search for Ella Brooks, long since scattered to the suburbs or passed into memory. But some things persisted across the decades, threads of continuity that refused to break no matter how much time passed. Mary Brooks, now 89 years old and living in a memory care facility in Longmeadow, still kept a photograph of Ella on her nightstand, the same Easter photo that had been pinned to Detective Sullivan's bulletin board, though Mary could no longer always remember who the smiling child in the pie tour was, or why looking at her made something in her chest ache with a grief that had no name. The years between 1964 and 2024 had not been kind to the Brooks family, each decade layering new sorrows onto the original wound of Ella's disappearance, until it became difficult to separate where one tragedy ended and another began. Mary had never really recovered from that June afternoon, never found a way to metabolize the loss of her daughter into something she could live with. She'd stayed in Springfield because leaving felt like abandoning Ella, like giving up on the possibility that her daughter might somehow find her way home, might show up on the doorstep one day with some impossible explanation for where she'd been. She kept Ella's room exactly as it had been, the small bed with its pink coverlid, the shelf of picture books, the toy box filled with dolls and blocks, all of it frozen in time like a shrine to a ghost. Patrick had wanted to pack it away after a few years, not from lack of love, but from the practical need to move forward, to make space for the living children who needed their mother's attention. But Mary wouldn't allow it, and that disagreement became one of many fault lines in their marriage, stress fractures that widened into chasms until Patrick moved out in 1972, 8 years after Ella vanished, the marriage another casualty of that terrible day. The 3 boys, Ella's brothers, grew up in the shadow of their missing sister, shaped by her absence in ways they wouldn't fully understand until they were adults themselves. Thomas, the oldest, became obsessed with law enforcement, spent his teenage years reading true crime books and watching cop shows, and joined the Springfield Police Department at 21, driven by some inchoate need to solve the unsolvable, to fix what had been broken. He worked patrol for 5 years and then moved to the Detective Bureau, and one of the first things he did was pull his sister's file from the archives, reading through decades of reports and witness statements and dead-end leads, trying to see something that Sullivan and all the other detectives missed. He never found it, but he kept looking, kept the case active in his mind even as it remained officially cold, and when he retired in 2015 after 34 years on the force, he passed the obsession along to younger detectives, made them promise to keep checking databases to stay alert for any information that might relate to a 4-year-old girl who disappeared in 1964. Michael, the middle brother, dealt with the trauma differently, channeling it into overprotectiveness that bordered on paranoia when his own children came along. He never let them out of his slighted playgrounds, installed elaborate security systems in his home, taught them never to talk to strangers with an intensity that sometimes frightened them. His wife had finally insisted on family therapy in the 90s, recognizing that Michael's anxiety was damaging their kids, and it had helped some, but he never fully shook the hypervigilance that came from knowing firsthand how quickly safety could shatter. David, the youngest, who'd been only 7 when Ella disappeared, remembered her least clearly, but perhaps felt her absence most acutely. That sense of a hole in the family that should have been filled by a sister. He'd moved to California in his 20s, put 3,000 miles between himself and Springfield, tried to build a life that wasn't defined by tragedy, but he still flew back every June for the anniversary vigil that Mary organized year after year until she became too frail to attend. Those vigils became a fixture in Springfield, a community ritual that evolved over the decades but never quite disappeared. In the early years, the turnout was large, hundreds of people gathering at Crafts Avenue Park on June 17th with candles and prayers and renewed determination to find Ella. Mary would stand by the swing set, sometimes speaking about her daughter, sometimes too overcome to say anything at all, while Patrick stood beside her looking hollowed out and exhausted. Local news crews covered the vigils for the first decade, especially the milestone anniversaries, the 5-year and 10-year marks prompting new investigations and age-progressed photos showing what Ella might look like at 9, at 14. Detective Sullivan attended every vigil until his death in 2003, always promising Mary he hadn't given up, that new leads were being pursued, though by then everyone knew the truth was that the trail had gone completely cold. By the 1980s, the vigils were smaller, mostly family and a core group of neighbors who remembered, but they persisted, an annual acknowledgement that Ella Brooks had existed and mattered and deserved to be remembered. The decade brought new attention to missing children cases nationally, milk cartons plastered with photos of the disappeared, organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children founded in 1984 to coordinate searches and maintain databases. Ella's case was entered into every news system, her information updated with age-progressed photos commissioned by NCMEC showing her theoretical appearance at 20, at 25, at 30. Mary kept these photos alongside the original Easter picture, studying them for hours, trying to reconcile the smiling 4-year-old she remembered with these imagined adult faces that might be walking around somewhere completely unaware of who they really were. The advent of the internet in the late 90s brought another wave of renewed interest. Amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts discovering old cases and creating websites and forums dedicated to solving them. Ella's disappearance was featured on several of these sites. People who'd never met her or lived in Springfield, spending hours analyzing the scant evidence, developing theories about what had happened, arguing in comment threads about whether the man in work clothes was significant or the station gone was connected, or if maybe Ella had simply wandered into the woods and died of exposure and her body had never been found. Some of these theories were thoughtful and well-researched. Others were wild speculation or conspiracy theories involving organized child trafficking rings and satanic cults. Mary's sons tried to shield her from the worst of the internet discussions, the people who treated their family tragedy as entertainment or puzzle to be solved. But Mary sometimes found the websites anyway and would spend hours reading through posts by strangers debating her daughter's fate, unable to look away even when it caused her pain. Patrick died in 1998, a heart attack at 68, and part of Mary died with him, whatever fragile thread had still connected her to her old life, finally severing. She'd never remarried after their separation, had lived alone in the house on Berkshire Avenue for 26 years, and now that solitude felt less like independence and more like abandonment. Her boys tried to convince her to move in with one of them, but she refused, insisted she needed to stay in the house in case Ella came home. The dementia started slowly in her mid-70s, little lapses in memory that seemed normal for her age, misplacing keys or forgetting appointments, but it accelerated in her 80s until she could no longer live safely alone. Thomas and his brothers moved her into memory care in 2019, and it was only then, when they finally had to clear out the house, that they packed up Ella's room, boxing up the toys and books and clothes that had sat untouched for 55 years, everything dusty and mouse-chewed and heartbreaking and its obsolescence. The Springfield Police Department created a dedicated cold case unit in 2015, part of a statewide initiative to apply new forensic techniques and fresh eyes to unsolved crimes. The unit was small, just 3 detectives working hundreds of cases spanning decades, prioritizing based on solvability factors and available evidence. Detective Sarah Chen joined the unit in 2019, 32 years old, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who'd settled in Boston. With degrees in criminal justice and forensic science, and a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. She'd grown up hearing about the Amy Brooks case, not because it had been famous, but because her mother had been fascinated by true crime and had told Sarah stories about missing children as cautionary tales, warnings about stranger danger and staying close in public places. When Chen pulled the Ella Brooks file as part of her systematic review of pre-1970 disappearances, she felt an unexpected connection to this little girl who'd vanished 36 years before Chen was even born. The file was massive. 5 boxes of reports and witness statements and tip sheets and photographs. Decades of investigative work that had led absolutely nowhere. Chen spent weeks reading through everything, making notes, creating timelines, trying to see patterns or connections that previous investigators might have missed. She found Detective Sullivan's original reports and was struck by how thorough he'd been, how many leads he'd pursued, how personally invested he'd seemed in finding Ella. She read Thomas Brooks's notes from his own investigation in the 80s and 90s, a son trying to solve his sister's disappearance, and felt the weight of all that accumulated grief and frustration. Most cold cases Chen worked were eventually solved through DNA evidence or forensic genealogy, matching biological material from crime scenes to genetic databases that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. But Ella's case had no DNA to work with, no physical evidence beyond those abandoned red shoes, no body, no crime scene beyond a playground that had been trampled by dozens of searchers before it could be properly processed. What Chen did have was information, thousands of pages of it, and she approached it the way she approached everything, methodically and without assumptions. She created a database of every person interviewed during the original investigation, cross-referencing names and addresses and looking for patterns. She mapped out the neighborhood as it existed in 1964, identifying every resident within a half-mile radius of the playground, then tracking forward to see where those people had moved, whether any of them had left town suddenly or had histories that might be relevant. It was tedious work, the kind of deep dive that required patience and tolerance for dead ends, but Chen had both in abundance. And 3 months into her review, she found something that made her pause, a small notation in a report from late June 1964 that had apparently been deemed insignificant at the time, but now looked potentially meaningful through the lens of 60 years and accumulated investigative experience. A couple had been interviewed on June 29th, 12 days after Ella disappeared because they'd been at Crafts Avenue Park the afternoon she vanished, though they'd left before 4 p.m. and hadn't witnessed anything related to the disappearance. Robert and Helen Walsh, ages 37 and 34, living in a rented house on Oakland Street about 6 blocks from the park. They'd been cooperative, answered questions, said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. The detective who'd interviewed them had noted they seemed nervous but attributed it to normal discomfort with police questioning. They had no children, had no criminal history, had no apparent connection to the Brooks family. The interview had been brief, and they'd been cleared as witnesses, and that was the end of it. Except Chen noticed something in the follow-up documentation. A routine check-in 2 weeks later found that the Walshes had moved out of their Oakland Street house suddenly, left no forwarding address, broken their lease with a month's rent forfeited. The landlord had been annoyed, but not suspicious, said tenants skipped out sometimes and it wasn't worth pursuing. The detective who'd followed up had made a note of it, but hadn't considered it significant enough to warrant further investigation, not when there were more promising leads to pursue. Chen pulled property records and found that Robert and Helen Walsh had resurfaced in Montpelier, Vermont in early 1965, buying a small house, Robert getting a job as a postal carrier. And then, according to school enrollment records Chen accessed through interstate law enforcement databases, they'd registered a daughter for kindergarten in September 1965, a daughter named Jennifer Walsh, birth date listed as April 1960, which would have made her 5 years old at enrollment, just about the right age. The record showed no birth certificate on file, just a note that it had been requested and would be provided later, which apparently it never was because there was no follow-up in the file. Chen felt her pulse quicken as she traced Jennifer Walsh forward through the decades. Public records painting a picture of a normal life, graduating high school in 1978, marrying in 1982, working as a librarian, living now in Portland, Maine. A woman who would be 64 years old, exactly the age Ella Brooks would be if she'd survived. It could be nothing, Chen reminded herself, forcing herself to stay objective, even as every investigative instinct told her this was something worth pursuing. Lots of adoptions in the 60s were informal, private arrangements that didn't generate much paperwork. Lots of couples moved suddenly for legitimate reasons. But the timing bothered her. The fact that the Walshes had left Springfield within weeks of Ella's disappearance and then appeared in Vermont with a daughter who hadn't existed in any prior records Chen could find. She dug deeper, requesting adoption records from Vermont, finding nothing. She contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to see if Jennifer Walsh had ever been reported missing or if there were any flags in the system. Nothing. She ran Jennifer's name through every database available to law enforcement, looking for any indication this woman knew she might have a different identity, finding only the mundane details of an ordinary life lived quietly in New England. Chen sat at her desk in the cold case unit office, surrounded by file boxes and computer screens, and made a decision that would either crack open a 60-year-old mystery or turn out to be another dead end in a case full of them. She would contact Jennifer Walsh carefully, with a cover story that wouldn't immediately alert her or cause panic. She would request a voluntary DNA sample, something she could compare against the genetic profiles of Ella's surviving brothers, which Chen had already obtained through Thomas Brooks, who was more than willing to cooperate in any attempt to solve his sister's disappearance. If the DNA matched, if Jennifer Walsh was actually Ella Brooks, then the case would transform from a cold missing person investigation into something far more complex and emotionally fraught. A woman who'd lived her entire adult life not knowing she'd been stolen, not knowing her real family had PS, not 60 years looking for her, not knowing that everything she believed about her origin was a lie built on kidnapping and deception. Chen picked up her phone and began making the calls that would set this final phase of the investigation in motion, aware that she was potentially about to detonate a bomb in someone's life, but also knowing that truth mattered, that justice mattered even 60 years later, that Mary Brooks deserved to know what happened to her daughter before she died, and that somewhere out there a woman named Jennifer Walsh might deserve to know who she really was, no matter how much that knowledge might hurt. Detective Sarah Chen made contact with Jennifer Walsh on a cold morning in February 2024, choosing her words carefully over the phone, introducing herself as a detective with the Springfield, Massachusetts Police Department working on a historical case involving identity theft and fraudulent adoption, records from the 1960s. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it wasn't entirely the truth either, and Chen felt the weight of that deception even as she kept her voice professionally neutral. Jennifer sounded puzzled but cooperative, a pleasant woman with a slight New England accent who said she'd be happy to help however she could, that yes, she'd been born in the 60s and adopted privately, though her parents had both passed away and she didn't have much documentation about the adoption itself. Chen explained that they were trying to eliminate people from their investigation, that a simple DNA sample would be sufficient to rule Jennifer out, and could she possibly visit the Portland Police Department at her convenience to provide a cheek swab. Jennifer agreed readily, seemingly unbothered by the request, and Chen hung up feeling both relieved and guilty, knowing this cooperative woman had no idea what storm was potentially about to break over her ordinary life. The DNA results came back 3 weeks later, and Chen stared at the report for a full minute before she could process what she was seeing. 99.9% probability of sibling relationship between Jennifer Walsh and Thomas Brooks. 99.9% probability between Jennifer Walsh and Michael Brooks. The genetic markers aligned perfectly. Jennifer Walsh was Ella Brooks. After 60 years, after thousands of investigative hours and countless dead ends and decades of grief, the missing 4-year-old had been found, alive, living under a different name just 300 miles from where she'd been taken, completely unaware she was the answer to a mystery that had entered her biological family for 6 decades. Chen felt a rush of emotions, triumph and sadness and anxiety about what came next, about how you tell someone that their entire identity is built on a lie, that their parents were kidnappers, that somewhere in Massachusetts an 89-year-old woman in a memory care facility had never stopped looking for her. Chen briefed her lieutenant, brought in the department's psychologist to help plan the approach, contacted Thomas Brooks, who broke down crying when she told him his sister had been found alive, conference with the FBI because interstate kidnapping fell under federal jurisdiction even though the perpetrators were long dead. Everyone agreed the revelation had to be handled delicately, that you couldn't just drop this information on Jennifer Walsh without support systems in place, without considering the psychological impact of learning at 64 that everything you believed about your childhood was false. Chen flew to Portland on a Tuesday in late March, accompanied by a victim advocate and a psychologist, and met Jennifer Walsh at a neutral location, a private room at Portland Police Department headquarters where they could talk without interruption or observation. Jennifer arrived looking exactly like the age-progressed photos the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had created over the years. The computer-generated images of what Ella Brooks might look like at 60, attempting to extrapolate from that 4-year-old face and coming remarkably lose to reality. She was petite like Ella had been small, with dark hair now streaked with gray, kind eyes that held the same shape as the little girl in the Easter photo. She smiled when she entered the room, still cooperative, still puzzled about why detectives from Massachusetts wanted to talk to her in person about some decades-old adoption fraud case. Chen asked her to sit down, introduced the advocate and the psychologist, and watched Jennifer's expression shift from curiosity to concern as she registered that this was more serious than she'd understood. Chen had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, consulted with experts on trauma disclosure, prepared herself for any number of reactions, but now that the moment was here, she felt the inadequacy of words, the impossibility of delivering this information in any way that wouldn't fundamentally shatter someone's understanding of reality. She started gently, asking Jennifer what she knew about her adoption, and Jennifer repeated what she'd said on the phone, that her parents, Robert and Helen Walsh, had adopted her privately in the early 60s, that they'd always been loving if somewhat overprotective, that she'd had a good childhood in Montpelier. She'd asked about her biological parents sometimes as a child, but her parents had been vague, said it was a closed adoption and they didn't have much information, and eventually she'd stopped asking because it seemed to make them uncomfortable. She'd never felt the need to search for her birth family, had been content with the family she had, and when her parents died, her father in 2008 and her mother in 2015, she'd mourned them deeply and never questioned the story of her origins. Chen listened to all of this and then took a breath and said the words that would change everything. Jennifer, we have reason to believe you were not adopted through any legal process. We believe you were abducted as a child from Springfield, Massachusetts in 1964 and raised under a false identity. Your real name is Ella Brooks, your biological mother is still alive, and your biological brothers have been searching for you for 60 years. The silence that followed was total and brittle, the kind of quiet that feels like something physical pressing against your eardrums. Jennifer's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to something that looked like anger. She said that was impossible, that her parents would never, that this had to be a mistake, that Chen must have confused her with someone else. Chen showed her the DNA results, explained the genetic match to Thomas and Michael Brooks, walked her through the evidence carefully and compassionately. She showed Jennifer the photograph of 4-year-old Ella Brooks from Easter 1964, and watched Jennifer's hands start shaking as she held it, because anyone looking at that photo and then at Jennifer's own childhood pictures, the few she had from age 4 and 5, could see they were the same child, the same face, the same eyes. Chen showed her the missing person reports from June 1964, the witness statements that mentioned the couple matching Robert and Helen Walsh's description at the playground that afternoon, the records showing the Walshes leaving Springfield suddenly and appearing in Vermont with a daughter who hadn't existed in any prior documentation. Jennifer's composure crumbled slowly and then all at once, tears streaming down her face as the implications sank in, as her brain tried to reconcile 60 years of memory with this new and terrible truth. The parents who'd raised her, who taught her to ride a bike and helped with her homework and walked her down the aisle at her wedding, had stolen her, had taken her from a playground, from a mother who was probably frantic, from brothers she'd never known existed, and built a life on that theft. Every birthday had been a lie, her birth certificate a fabrication, her name not really her name. The psychologist intervened, talking Jennifer through the shock, helping her process, explaining that this was trauma, and it was normal to feel overwhelmed and confused and angry all at once. The advocate explained what resources were available: counseling services and support groups for people who discovered unexpected truths about their identities. Chen sat quietly and let the professionals do their work, watching this woman who'd been Ella Brooks for 4 years and Jennifer Walsh for 60 struggle to figure out who she was now. The days that followed were a blur of revelations and painful reconstructions. Jennifer, who insisted people still call her Jennifer because she couldn't process being Ella yet, met with Chen multiple times to go through the evidence, to understand what had happened. They pieced together a timeline based on police records and Jennifer's fragmentary early memories, things she'd always dismissed as dreams or imagination, but now took on new significance. She remembered a woman who sang Irish lullabies, songs her mother Helen had never sung, songs that Mary Brooks had sung to all her children. She remembered playing on swings and feeling happy, a flash of memory that didn't fit with her parents' story that she'd been adopted as an infant. She remembered being confused for a while after coming to live with Robert and Helen, asking for someone named Mama. Being told firmly that Helen was her mama now and she needed to forget about before. These fragments had always been there in her subconscious, but she'd never had a framework to understand them, had accepted her parents' explanations that she was remembering dreams or conflating stories she'd been told with actual memories. Chen arranged for Jennifer to meet her biological brothers, and the meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in early April at a hotel in Boston, neutral territory equidistant from Springfield and Portland. Thomas Brooks arrived first, 64 years old now, retired from the police force, carrying a folder full of photographs and mementos he'd saved from Ella's short time with their family. Michael came from Connecticut, where he'd settled after leaving Springfield, looking nervous and emotional. They'd agreed beforehand not to overwhelm Jennifer, to let her control the pace of the reunion. But when she walked into the room and they saw her face, so like their mother's face, so like the sister they barely remembered but had never forgotten, all the careful planning dissolved into tears and deckward hugs and apologies for crying. Jennifer stood stiff in their embraces, still processing, still not entirely convinced this was real. But she looked at the photographs Thomas spread across the table and couldn't deny the evidence. There she was at age 3, birthday party with a homemade cake. There she was at age 2, holding a stuffed rabbit. There she was as an infant in Mary's arms. And the love in Mary's face was unmistakable. The fierce protective love of a mother for her daughter, and Jennifer felt something crack open in her chest because she'd been loved, had been wanted, had been desperately searched for, even if she'd never know. In it. The brothers told her about Mary, about the vigils and the decades of hope and the dementia that had slowly stolen her ability to remember why she was sad. They told her about their father Patrick, who died still not knowing what happened to Ella. They told her about Detective Sullivan's obsession with the case, about Thomas joining the police force because of her, about how her disappearance had shaped all of their lives in ways large and small. Jennifer listened and tried to absorb it. This alternate history where she was Ella Brooks, where she had a completely different family who'd never stopped loving her, and the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. She'd had a good life as Jennifer Walsh. She'd had parents who loved her, even if that love was built on a crime. She had her own husband and 2 adult children and grandchildren, an entire identity and history that felt real and true. How was she supposed to reconcile that with being Ella Brooks, stolen child, missing person, the ghost that haunted a family for 60 years? Chen arranged for Jennifer to visit Mary in the memory care facility, and they made the trip on a warm day in May when spring was finally asserting itself across New England. Thomas and Michael came too, wanting to be there for both women, knowing this moment was fragile and precious and might be the only one they got before Mary's dementia progressed further. Mary was in the common room when they arrived, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at nothing with the blank expression that had become her default. She was tiny now, diminished by age and illness, but her eyes were still the same brown as Jennifer's eyes, still held traces of the woman she'd been. Thomas knelt beside her wheelchair and said, "Mom, we brought someone to see you, someone very special," and Mary turned her head slowly, focusing with difficulty. Jennifer stepped forward, her heart pounding, not knowing what to say or do, and Mary looked at her face for a long moment, confusion shifting to something else, something like recognition or maybe just hope. And then she reached out one trembling hand and whispered, "Ella. Oh, Ella, I knew you'd come home." Jennifer broke down completely then, sinking to her knees beside the wheelchair and letting Mary touch her face with those fragile hands. And Mary was crying too, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, saying, I waited so long, I never stopped looking for you, baby." It didn't matter that Mary's lucidity was temporary, that she'd probably forget this moment by tomorrow, that the dementia would steal it away just like it had stolen so much else. What mattered was this instant of recognition, This brief window where mother and daughter connected across 60 years of separation, where Mary got to know that Ella had been found, that her child had lived, that the story had an ending, even if it wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen. They stayed for an hour, Thomas and Michael watching with tears in their eyes as their mother talked to their sister in fragments of memory, telling her about the red shoes she loved, about the Easter dress, about things from 1964 as if they'd happened yesterday. When it was time to leave, Mary held Jennifer's hand and said, "Don't go, don't leave me again." And Jennifer promised she wouldn't, promised she'd come back, even though she knew Mary wouldn't remember the promise or the visit or maybe even who Jennifer was. Mary Brooks died 3 weeks later, a peaceful death in her sleep, and the family held a funeral where they mourned her but also celebrated that she died knowing Ella had been found. Jennifer attended the funeral, still struggling with her dual identity, but beginning to accept that she was both Jennifer and Ella, that she didn't have to choose one or erase the other. She legally changed her name to Jennifer Ella Walsh Brooks, a hyphenate that acknowledged both her lives, both her families. She began therapy to process the trauma of discovering her origins, the complicated grief of loving parents who'd committed a terrible crime, the anger at being robbed of her biological family while simultaneously grateful for the life she'd had. Her husband and children struggled to understand but tried to be supportive, and her biological brothers became part of her extended family, not replacing the Walshes, but adding to the complicated tapestry of who Jennifer Ella was. The legal aftermath was anticlimactic because both kidnappers were dead. No one left to prosecute or punish. The FBI closed the case as solved, updating their records to show Ella Brooks had been recovered alive after 60 years. The media coverage was intense for a few weeks, the story too compelling not to attract attention. The retired librarian from Portland who'd been a missing child from Massachusetts. The family reunion that came 6 decades too late. Jennifer gave a few interviews and then retreated from the spotlight, wanting privacy to process everything away from public scrutiny. She visited Springfield and saw the house on Berkshire Avenue where she'd lived for 4 years, saw Crafts Avenue Park where she'd been taken. And standing by the swing set, she felt a strange disconnect, like looking at a crime scene from someone else's life even though it was hers. On a quiet afternoon in October, Jennifer returned to that playground alone, needing to be there without cameras or family or witnesses, just her and the ghosts of what happened 60 years ago. She sat on a bench near the swing sets and tried to remember that day, June 17, 1964, the day her life split into 2 incompatible narratives. She couldn't remember it, the memories lost to time and trauma, and the fact she'd been so young, but she imagined it, the sunny afternoon, and the woman who was her mother watching from this bench, and the moment when everything changed. She thought about the 4-year-old who'd left her red shoes behind, and the 64-year-old who'd been found, and the 60 years in between that had been lived under false pretenses, but were still her years, still her life. She thought about Mary Brooks, who the 500th waited until her last breath for this closure, and about Helen Walsh, who'd stolen a child but also raised her with love, and about the impossibility of justice when everyone involved was either dead or irrevocably damaged. Detective Chen had done her job, solved the unsolvable case, brought answers to a family that had waited 60 years, but sitting in her office afterward she felt less triumphant than melancholy. She'd returned Ella Brooks to her family, but in doing so had taken Jennifer Walsh's certainty about her identity. She'd given closure to the living and the dead, but at a cost that was hard to calculate. Still, she promised Thomas Brooks she'd find the truth, and she had, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all justice could be sometimes, not satisfaction or resolution, but simply truth spoken aloud and acknowledged, no matter how painful or how late it arrived. She filed the final report and closed the case file and moved on to the next unsolved mystery, carrying with her the lesson that some stories don't have happy endings, only true ones, and even that is more than most cold cases ever get. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know. And if this story moved you, there are dozens of other cases on this channel where justice took decades but finally arrived. The story of Ella Brooks reminds us that sometimes the missing aren't lost, just living under different names in different places, unaware they're the answer to someone else's desperate question. Jennifer Ella Walsh Brooks lives quietly now in Portland, navigating the strange terrain between 2 identities, 2 families, 2 completely different lives that somehow belong to the same person. She has relationships with her biological brothers, visits their families, integrates the Brooks history into her understanding of herself. But she also honors the memory of Robert and Helen Walsh, complicated as that is, because they were her parents too, regardless of how she came to be theirs. She exists in the uncomfortable space between victim and beneficiary, stolen and loved, lost and found, and she's learning to live with all those contradictions because that's what survival looks like sometimes, accepting that truth is rarely simple and identity is more fluid than we want to believe. Mary Brooks got her answer before she died, got to touch her daughter's face one last time, and maybe that's the grace this story offers, imperfect and insufficient but real, a reminder that even when justice comes too late to undo the damage, it still matters, still means something, still honors the love that refuses to give up, even when every rational reason says it should.